Alright, what's going on everyone? Today I'm going to show you how to upgrade the 2021 Red Aggro Challenger Deck into a Pioneer deck. We will not exceed the deck's retail price with our upgrades, which is around $30 USD. That's going to be our budget. A quick note though before getting into this is there is technically a Pioneer Red Aggro Challenger deck. It's technically a burn deck. If you haven't purchased either the standard or Pioneer deck, you might be further ahead just starting with the Pioneer deck. However, if you already own the standard deck, I don't think it's really worth it. The Pioneer version has plenty of its own problems, and it doesn't really contain a ton of valuable cards. It does have a lot of key pieces for the more burn prowess build of the deck, but none of them are super valuable. So we're going to just start with this standard deck and upgrade it for Pioneer. I also want to state though that this is a very tumultuous time for Red Aggro because just a couple weeks ago, at least when I was building this deck, Outlaws of Thunder Junction released and it came with Slick Shot Show Off, and this card has proven to be incredibly powerful. Not only has it dominated best of one standard, but it's also been making quite an appearance in Pioneer. You can play these with the other prowess creatures and a bunch of powerful spells to make a really strong spell-based Red Aggro deck. However, the show off is currently $20 each or close to it. So we're going to be sticking with this more creature-based aggro that came with the standard Challenger deck. So the Challenger deck was built around the time that Red Devotion was big in standard, so you get cards like Annex, Embercleave, and Torbran. They allowed Annex to get huge, and Embercleave could just win the game in a single attack. Not only does Annex get a bunch of power, he gets double strike, and each time he hits, he gets +2 with Torbran, and Torbran of course also adds a bunch of devotion, so that was the foundation of this deck in standard. And honestly, most of it's still playable. Torbran might be a little bit weak for Pioneer, but not terrible. And that's true for plenty of the other stuff in the deck. You know, there's Fervent Champion, Bone Crusher Giant, there's some burn spells, and I think all of these are perfectly fine. The problem is with cards like Akum Hellhound, Rimrock Knight, Kargan Intimidator. These are definitely dated. They were played in standard, but in Pioneer we just have better options, especially the Hellhound. I mean, that just definitely hasn't held up compared to the other 1-mana threats in Pioneer. So yeah, let's just get started. We'll take out 4 Akum Hellhounds for 4 Monastery Swiftspear. The Hellhound is very powerful if you can consistently play lands. The problem is, we're a Red Aggro deck, we're not looking to play a ton of lands, and once you've played, 3 or 4, you're not going to be playing them every turn, and the Hellhound just stops working, basically. The Swiftspear, on the other hand, it only gets +1/+1 when we cast spells, but it's great. It has haste, it can attack turn 1, and it can still attack even if we don't have spells to trigger it, which just makes it much more consistent. This is played in every Red Aggro deck in every format ever, so yeah, definitely worth playing. Next, we'll take out 4 Rimrock Knights for 4 Kumano Faces Kakazan. The Knights have always felt really clunky. You can't cast the Adventure on turn 1, right? So it doesn't do anything, which means you either get a 3/1 on turn 2, which is pretty bad, or you get the Pump Spell on turn 2, and then it comes down as a 3/1 on turn 3. Now in standard, that was pretty good value. You just pump a creature and then you add another attacker on turn 4 or 5 or whatever. But it's just not as strong as the Saga, which is going to, for 1 mana, deal 1 damage. That's nothing great, but that's fine. Then the next creature you play the next turn gets a +1/+1 counter. So that makes us much more aggressive. And then it flips into a 2/2 with haste that we ultimately paid 1 mana for, potentially on turn 1. So it's a lot of power for just 1 mana, 1 damage, 1 +1/+1 counter, and a 2/2 for 1 mana. I mean, that's just great. Super efficient, super mana efficient. Getting all of that on 1 mana is pretty good when you are a super, mana efficient aggro deck. Next, we'll take out 2 Kargan Intimidators for 2 Karizev Skyship Raiders. So Karizev is kind of, it's not played in every Red Aggro deck. It's if you look at all Red Aggro decks across all Pioneer, it might be played in 20 to 30% of decks, but it works pretty well in our build. So first off, when she attacks, she makes a 2/1. So she's effectively 3 power for 2 mana. when she's attacking, and she has Menace, which makes the main creature, that being Karizev, difficult to block and kill in combat, but since she technically makes 2 attackers, that helps reduce the cost of Embercleave, right? She's a sort of 3 power 2-drop, great for aggro, that's going to reduce Embercleave by 2, and also by splitting our attack into 2 creatures, that technically makes Torbran better because he's going to add an additional 2 damage per red source. So we've, made 2 red sources that are dealing damage. That's why Karizev isn't always played in every red aggro deck, but with our Embercleave and Torbran build, she actually works pretty well. Next, we'll take out 2 Intimidators for 2 Eidolon of Great Revel. This is basically just an absolute chaos card. It's a 2 mana 2/2 that will deal 2 damage to people when they cast something that costs 3 or less. So in Pioneer, decks are usually much more optimized. They're playing a lot of 1 to 3 drops. Most decks are almost entirely composed of 1 to 3 drops. So basically it just says, if somebody casts something, they take 2 damage. And the whole point of this is just to tank life totals as quickly as possible. Our goal as a red aggro deck is just to attack, get their life total down. So we don't care if our life total goes down so long as their life total also goes down, and it should go down even faster since we are the aggro player. Next, we're going to take out 2 Spikefield Hazard for 2 Monstrous Rage. This has proven to be very powerful in aggro decks, so it gives +2/+0, but it also makes a monster roll token, which will give +1/+1 and trample. So this is very good with like Monastery Swiftspear, right? You play Swiftspear on turn 1, turn 2, you can make it a 5/4 trampler, which is pretty good, and it leaves that monster roll token. Next, we're going to take out 3 Royal Eruptions for 3 Lightning Strike. So this might seem weird because the Royal Eruption is kind of all upside, right? They're both 2 mana, they both deal 3 damage to anything, but you can kick it for an extra 2 damage, but the sorcery speed is a major bummer. Lightning Strike gives you a lot of versatility, allowing you to wait until blockers are declared to decide where to aim your burn spell. You can also cast it at the end of the opponent's turn. If you're against another aggro deck, you could cast it to kill something getting targeted by a monstrous rage, right? The versatility of instant speed is very relevant, and Royal Eruption, while it can be kicked for more damage, you're very rarely ever going to reach 7 mana anyway, so there will be like a 1 in 100 chance that that kicker would have won you the game, but it's going to be offset by the just constant upside of the instant speed of the Lightning Strike for sure. And finally, we're going to take out the 4th Royal Eruption for 1 more Embercleave. I think it could be worth it to go up to 3 of these, to be honest, but the big issue, there's 2 issues. They're a little bit expensive, and I think our creature count is a little too low to justify playing more than 2. If you're going to play 3 to 4 Embercleaves, I think you really want to fill your deck with a lot of attacking creatures, and we do have still quite a bit of burn and pumping spells. I think 2 Embercleaves is fine. They're going to win us the game sometimes for sure, especially if we get to combine it with Annex. So definitely an improvement. I'm just a little bit hesitant to go up to 3 or 4 without maybe changing the ratios of creatures and spells in the deck. Moving on to the mana base, the great news about a monocolor deck is we don't have to worry about dual lands. No dual lands, and that makes our mana base super cheap. There are a couple of small changes we can make though, like taking out 2 mountains for 2 Ramanap Ruins. While they do cost life to tap, they only cost life if we tap it for red, so we generally want to try to use these for colorless portions of mana cost if we can, but our life total is rarely relevant anyway. Only against opposing aggro decks does our life total really matter, and the extra damage we can get from sacrificing it can sometimes just win games. So definitely worth it. We can also take out a mountain for a Sakensin Crucible of Defiance, and I will say, I suppose we could consider this optional. The card only costs a few dollars, so it's within our budget, but something I try to consider when doing these upgrades is it worth spending $4 on this land in this deck if you have another deck that the $4 could go further in that deck, right? So with that in mind, yeah, I could say this is very optional, but with our $30 budget, we do have room for this, and the ability to channel the land for a couple hasty 1/1s can sometimes win us games. It's the type of card that 9 times out of 10, you're probably just going to play it as a land, but just having that utility can sometimes win a game. Moving on to the sideboard, as always, I encourage you to tailor your sideboard to your local metagame, but I'm going to suggest taking out 2 Soulseers tiers for 2 tiers of Valakut. Soulseer was okay in Standard, but the tiers are much more common in Pioneer, allowing you to destroy like blue control finishers and also turning off counter spells. The fact that it can't be countered is why it's so relevant. So for a similar reason, I want to take out 2 Red Cap Melee for 2 Rending Volley. This is very similar. Compared to the tiers, it does 1 damage less, but it can target non-flying creatures. They also have to be white and blue, but once again, it can't be countered. So against like blue-white control and stuff, this can be very useful for eliminating their game-winning threats. We also want to take out 2 Thundering Rebukes for 2 Witchstalker Frenzies. These are both just creature answers, right? The idea here is if we're against like a green Stompy deck, for example, we want a kind of heavy hitter burn spell to burn off a big green defensive creature. The Witchstalker, though, it kills bigger creatures and it can do it for less mana. Sometimes it's 1 mana, deal 5 damage, right? So very useful. And finally, I think we can take out 2 Red Cap Melees for 2 End of Festivities. This is very useful for decks that put out a bunch of 1/1 tokens, like Boros Convoke, for example, which can be a real nuisance because they can very easily just stack tokens on our creatures and trade in ways that aren't very favorable for us. So being able to just wipe those decks would be very nice. I also want to mention a couple of non-budget upgrades. In the sideboard, you could potentially swap out Relic Robbers for Rampaging Ferocidons. People like these because there's some versatility here. First off, it can punish decks that put out a bunch of small creatures. But more importantly, it turns off life gain. Angel decks are brutal against Red Aggro because not only do they make big defensive blockers, but they also gain life, and that can be pretty devastating. So this solves half the problem. The other half would be, those removal spells we just looked at. And in the main board, you can replace these shocks with Play with Fire. It's functionally identical with the upside of scrying for 1 when you hit a player. There's literally no reason to play Shock anymore. It should always be Play with Fire first. The only reason you should play Shock is for budget concerns because these Play with Fires, they keep going up. The last time I talked about them, they were $2 each. I believe they're getting close to $4 to $5 each now. So they just keep going up. They're expensive, so not necessary. But if you have any, swap out shocks with Play with Fire for sure. Anyway, that is it for our upgrades. While we aren't a fully fleshed out tier 1 meta Red Aggro deck, we're definitely much closer than where we were before. And the deck should be much more powerful and much more capable of winning as a result of that. Particularly with cards like Akum Hellhound and Rimrock Knight out of the deck, you should definitely be finding yourself winning with this thing much more consistently. So be sure to check the description below. I will leave a link to the completed deck list as well as some tier 1 Red Aggro decks. There are many builds, right? There's creature-based Red Aggro decks, there's the sort of Gruul decks that are pretty similar, and there's the Prowess decks that are more burn focused. So I'll try to leave some examples of all of those. So check the description for that. But in the meantime, I hope this video was useful. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next one.